Okay, well, why don't I start introducing our discussants here. Thank you guys all for joining us. This is going to be a free-floating discussion rather than prepared talks. I'm glad you're all here. We're going to be talking about social media. Now, we've got three wonderful experts on social media, all coming from overlapping but different directions. So first, let me introduce Regina Rini, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy at York, where she holds the Canada Research Chair in Moral and Social Cognition. Before that, she was at NYU, where she was Professor of Bioethics. And she writes consistently for the New York Times, for the LA Times, and has a column for the Times Literary Supplement. She has an award-winning essay in Eon on raising good robots, and has a brand new book out, we were just talking about, on the ethics of microaggressions. Gina. And then we have Molly Crocket, who is the Assistant Professor of Psychology at Yale, where she studies morality from many, many different angles. Molly's won virtually every award there is to get in her field. In fact, I was looking at her CV, and the list of awards takes up literally a full page. So I'm not going to read those out. Instead, I'm going to say that she currently holds the title for having conducted the study that I'm most envious of somebody having conducted. So she has a recent paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences where, among other things, she studied how psychedelics make people more socially connected at Burning Man. So she is a genius young neuroscientist and a hippie. And then Jay Van Bavel, Associate Professor at NYU, who studies, among other things, political polarization, technology, and more recently has been investing a lot of time communicating how the insights of the social sciences can help us through the pandemic. So the combination of those three things means that over the last 9 months, with the election and the pandemic, Jay has become effectively the most famous and productive social psychologist in the world. And now this has to be part of every introduction for Jay, which is that if you are a regular viewer of the Kelly Clarkson show, you might recognize Jay as that psych prof who got trapped in an elevator with his kids, but managed to still teach his intro class to 360 students over Zoom on his cell phone. So we've got a real Zoom expert here with us, which is great. Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. So, like I mentioned, I want this to be a discussion. You guys have so much interesting overlapping work that I'm sure you guys can all just talk to yourselves, amongst yourselves for the full hour. Speaking of which, we'll do 45 minutes amongst ourselves, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. If you could just write your question in the chat, then we can figure out which questions to ask from there. Okay, so it occurred to me while I was putting together those intros that the four of us are basically the same age. I think we're, maybe within 5 years of each other, which means that we probably all had the same experience of what the internet was like when we were teenagers, which was, it was just getting going. It was this kind of untamed Wild West, and it had this utopian ethos to it. And it also occurred to me that that utopian ethos carried on for actually quite a long time, right? So you can see this embodied in something like Wikipedia. And this carried on even up to 2010. And then in 2010, and really in the last 5 years, something seemed to happen where the internet became sort of a toxic force. So first, what happened? Gina, I'm going to go to you first on this. So what happened, and are these concerns about the toxicity that the internet, and in particular social media, has on us, have they been overblown, or have they been appropriately blown?
Well, thanks first for organizing this. I think this will be a really good conversation. So I like that framing and that historical way of coming at it, because I think you're right that it feels like something different happened in the last decade. And of course, it's worth remembering that the last decade is when social media really took off, that Facebook was founded in the mid 2000s, Twitter about 2007, 2006, I forget exactly which year it was, and really began spiraling upwards in terms of usership around 2010 and thereafter. And so we're thinking about the last decade in particular. The one thing I would say, though, is that some of the things we think of as the terrible stuff about the internet had always been there before. it had been on the internet back from the very beginning. You would have anonymous people on forums starting flame wars with one another. That goes back to the 1990s. So some of the things we think about as like bad behavior is not new. However, what is new is the sort of prominence of it, because it was back in the 90s, using the internet was at least initially kind of a hobbyist thing. Like if you look back at sitcoms from the 1990s, you see people making jokes about how somebody's hobby is I don't know, golfing, and somebody's hobby is art, and somebody else's hobby is computers, in a way that that is funny today to think about, but was definitely true 20, 25 years ago. And the change that happened in the last decade or so is that it just became pervasive, where not being on the internet and not being on social media is something that makes you stand out in the way that being a computer user made you stand out 25 years ago. So I think that's the fundamental change, not so much that people are behaving differently now, but that everybody's a part of it now, or social media is the internet is a part of all forms of life now, in a way that the same bad behavior is magnified now. It's unavoidable, inescapable now.
Yeah, and I guess in addition to everybody being a part of it, everybody's sort of a part of it all the time, because we're constantly connected to it via smartphones, which are also, only about 10 years old in terms of prominence. So just, Gina, sticking with you for a second, you've talked about how this threat of social media is now a real threat to our democracy. Why would you say that?
So I'm caught on how much I want to say, because I go on forever. I'm writing a book about this right now. And the thesis of the book is that democracy is endangered by social media. So I could talk to you for hours about this. But the core question, I think, has to do with the presumptions we have of each other. We presume that other citizens in a democracy will behave in certain ways. We expect them to be epistemically responsible. That is, they are thoughtful about what information they share and why they believe the things they believe. And we expect them to treat each other as equals. That's a fundamental presupposition of a democracy. So there's a cluster of other issues around that, which I would talk more about. But the key thing I'm worried about is that our interactions on social media are introducing us to the idea that we don't fulfill those presuppositions, that we're not epistemically responsible because we share fake news and other garbage, and that we don't treat each other as equals because we're prone to partisan and manipulative and vicious ways of treating each other. And the longer we go on living days where every single day we have some little hit of seeing people behave epistemically irresponsibly and treating each other not as equals, erodes our mutual confidence in the tenability of democracy as a good and morally valuable project. And so that's my worry, is that we're on a slow course of being conditioned to think of each other not as equal responsible citizens, but as opponents, enemies, or just irrelevant bots on the internet. If that happens, that's what I'm worried about, the long term, where we end up in 10, 15, 20 years.
Okay, great. Well, so Jay, you've been tracking some of this polarization in your lab, and you've published some of the kind of main papers on this. Does that ring true to you? And do you see it going in the same trajectory?
Yeah, I mean, I have been on social media long enough to remember I get these like memory updates on Facebook every day about like a picture I posted like 8 years ago, status update like 10, 12, 15 years ago. And it's amazing to see the difference in even what I posted. And I post a lot of like political news now, whereas I used to post like I'm eating a burrito, it's, delicious or something like that. And the way that your update was even framed, you couldn't put photos, there wasn't really content to share, like links to articles. People didn't really use it as a news feed so much as just like an update of what their friends were kind of thinking, their like whimsical thoughts at the moment. And the way that the companies have changed the algorithms and features and design structure of social media has made them fortunes. And now, I think last time I checked, 3 to 4 billion people are on social media. The average person, I saw one factoid, swipes through 300 feet of their news feed on social media a day. So that means if you have a phone like I do, an iPhone, every time you swipe down, that's 6 inches. You're doing that 600 times a day. And so we are glued into this machine in a way that we weren't. And then not only that, the information it's giving us is different. And the way that the way that I think of it now is very structural. What has been monetized by these technology giants is things that foment conflict, polarization, outrage, as Molly's shown. They keep us hooked. And I had a friend who was a co-author I was chatting with this morning about it, and he said, I wonder if like, and Trump, of course, Donald Trump is like the master of fomenting outrage and sharing misinformation and not playing by the epistemological rules. When my friend said to me, a colleague said, I wonder if people search more for Trump now than porn on the internet. Like, and he found that there's almost this hydraulic relationship over time. It's like we've replaced one vice with another. And we all, you know, it's not just conservatives who are amplifying Trump. I see liberals, Democrats through my feed all day long, amplifying or reacting to or expressing outrage or critiquing Trump. And I know Molly's always reminds me that when we do that, we fuel other people seeing it because it signals that that's an important message because a lot of people are commenting on it or sharing it or quote tweeting it. And so we get sucked in and have these unintentional effects of our behavior because the way that the algorithms are designed is to amplify attention. And how it does that is by fomenting conflict in ways that aren't necessarily pro-democracy, pro-truth, pro-accuracy, all those things that Regina just mentioned.
So, okay, so Molly, so it seems like then the people behind these algorithms are excellent psychologists. What are the psychological factors that they're kind of tapping into and exploiting there?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think that it's pretty well known at this point that the designers of these algorithms and the user experience of the platforms are really incorporating core principles from psychology into the design of the experience. And that includes reinforcement learning. So when we get rewarded by our peers for doing something on social media, we're more likely to do it again. And attention is a key principle. Attention equals money. And so those algorithms are going to be designed specifically to promote the kind of information that grab our attention. And you don't actually need to know anything about human psychology to design an algorithm using machine learning methods to become really, really good over time at promoting the material and content that grabs our attention, because all you need is data. And if you have 3 to 4 billion people a day scrolling, you know, through 600 feeds and choosing what to spend time on and what to share, then all of that data is constantly making the algorithms even better at what they do. And one really worrying consequence of the fact that, as Jay mentioned, you know, moral and emotional content grabs our attention and is shared more online is that we are losing the ability to really understand how other people feel about current events in the world. And so I can have a sense from scrolling my own news feed that people are really outraged about the latest thing that Trump has done. But I have no way of knowing how accurate that belief is, because that belief is based on information that has a huge selection bias. And so we're now living in a world where we don't understand really well what the temperature is of our own group. And we also don't really understand the temperature of the other side, because what we share is the worst examples of the other side. And oftentimes that contains misinformation as well. So like after the election, Trump was tweeting all this crazy stuff about, you know, fake things that didn't actually happen. And my entire newsfeed was people retweeting this with outrage. And that has the effect of spreading the disinformation further around. And so, you know, it's really, really concerning. Circling back to what Gina said, like, an essential feature of democracy is having shared information, a shared sense of what is true. And we're just, I think, living through this perfect storm of consequences that were perhaps not intended or foreseen by the designers of social media. But I mean, it's, you know, it's clear now what's going on.
So that's interesting that it suggests that we have, not only is there a polarization as Jay's work has shown, but it's also that we're perceiving an even more polarized world than exists by seeing this kind of selective group or selective tweets from a selective group off the other side. And there's this concept of false polarization showing that we do exaggerate how the terrible things we assume about the other groups. Jay or Jeannie, any of you guys, do you want to talk about this false polarization thing? Jay, you know stuff about this, right?
I'll say a few words. Yeah, so Azim makes a great point that even though we're at a moment historically of enormously high polarization in the US, the trends are emerging in Canada too. I'm Canadian, so I keep up a little bit of politics there. There is, despite that, there is what's called false polarization, which means that we perceive the differences to be greater than they are. So even though the differences are great and have gotten greater, we still overperceive them, and we have all these terribly inaccurate stereotypes about people who are different than us politically. I give talks on this, and I get people to, guess how many Republicans make over $250,000 a year. So guess what percentage in your mind. Guess what percentage of Democrats are LGBTQ. And people often come up with guesses that are 30 to 40%. In reality, the number is about 2% and 5%. So, because we're fed caricatures. The reason we're fed caricatures that aren't necessarily representative of the other group is because that's what sells. It's not just what can be monetized on social media. It's also obviously mainstream media is amplifying caricatures. You can turn Fox News and see like campus crazies, and they'll find one campus where one protest looks insane. And it's like, I'm not seeing that at all as I go from campus to campus in my normal life. And so you can cherry pick these cases. Now, it's made worse a little bit by social media because the number of posts coming from most people on social media are coming from a tiny sliver of the people at the most extreme belief systems. And not just political belief systems. You can be an extreme cat enthusiast, and then you're going to be the one churning out all the content on cats and cat videos on Insta. And so anybody who's extreme in one dimension is the person who's going to be creating the norms on the social media platform. And then that creates what's known as false consensus, that we misperceive what other people believe because a small number of extremely committed people are producing most of the content on that platform.
Yeah, I want to return to false consensus a little bit more when we talk about mobbing and public outrage. But for now, Gina, you've talked about the sort of Russian troll farms as well as bots. To what degree are these kind of Russian trolls versus bots versus the people just sharing selectively? What's the relative weight in all of these in contributing to the spread of fake news?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the answer is we don't know for sure, and it keeps changing. There have been studies done of 2016 and 2014, the Scottish independence referendum in the UK, and then the Brexit referendum, and then the US 2016 election. And basically, as a percentage, stuff coming from Russian bot farms is a relatively small percentage of the total amount of tweets. However, it gets amplified to pretty high degrees. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but it's a surprisingly large amount of the tweets about, I believe, Brexit were connected in some way. At least the ones that were done in the last few hours before the referendum, during the day of the referendum, were connected in some way to these bot networks. So we know that they're powerful. However, they're also really simplistic. They tend to produce just fairly simple, fairly generic messages that are meant to stir up trouble. And so most of the work that's being done is being done by ordinary people who are either not even aware of these bot networks or interacting with them only marginally. Most of the work is being done by us to ourselves, which I think is the worry. So like the problem, the thing I've been trying to think about for the last couple of years is, sure, let's grant that there are external actors, primarily Russian so far, although surely other people are doing this, who are trying to interfere in democratic societies. But they wouldn't be able to do it successfully if it weren't for the citizens of those societies themselves amplifying the content they inject into public discussion and commenting on it. Like Molly mentioned earlier, sometimes people aren't agreeing with the inflammatory content. They are instead trying to share with others how incensed they are by the fact that the inflammatory content exists. And in doing so, they're doing the work of the people who created the inflammatory content to begin with. So there's lots of different ways to measure or think about what's primarily responsible here. As far as just pure numbers, these deliberately malicious actors are probably a small percentage, but in terms of their impact, they really do get filtered out through all of us. And then we all become complicit in this bigger system that amplifies and spends forever arguing about these things online.
Mm. So if we're complicit, what would be, and do you guys engage in responsible social media behavior? So have you guys yourselves taken any steps to rein yourselves in or to modify the way you guys are engaging in order to both do for yourself, maybe for your own mental health, and generally for the world, modeling what would be an appropriate way of using social media?
Oh, Molly, go ahead.
Oh, well, I can just say that it's really hard, because I think that one way to avoid inadvertently sharing misinformation or inflammatory content is to be thoughtful about it and to be aware that this is happening. But that is only going to work to the extent that social media behavior is intentional and thoughtful in the first place. And as I mentioned earlier, platform designers are using principles of reinforcement learning to guide and shape our behaviors on the platforms. And so my collaborator, Billy Brady, and I have shown recently that when you express outrage online, you get more likes and shares from your friends. And over time, this increases the likelihood that you express more outrage in the future. And thinking about it from the perspective of reinforcement learning, if you repeatedly reinforce a behavior, over time that behavior becomes less intentional and more of a habit, and therefore less under your control. And so undoubtedly what's happening on social media now, particularly around really inflammatory and outrage provoking comment, is you're scrolling through your feed and you see something that provokes an emotional reaction and you just mindlessly retweet it or share it. And you're not thinking about the consequences, because the psychological system that you are using to share that behavior is not one that thinks about consequences. It's responding to stimuli. And that's a problem, because if moral discourse that's happening in public places is beyond our intentional control by virtue of the way that the platforms are set up, that is going to make those discussions less thoughtful and less considerate of the long-term consequences. And like ultimately, I think we all really want to think that we're in control of and intentional about the way we discuss the most important issues that face society. But my big worry is that the very design of the platforms makes it difficult, if not impossible, to use them thoughtfully.
And I guess it also assumes that people want to be thoughtful and want to be accurate with this, which I think maybe is something that academics like us may be
overly optimistic.
Yeah, I mean, I found just in terms of my own Twitter use, I think Jay was one of the very first people that I followed when I joined Twitter, I don't know, in 2012 or something. And I followed him specifically because he would just retweet interesting psychology studies. And Jay, you've actually been pretty consistent about that over the last 8 years. But in the meantime, the rest of my feed is filled with people getting outraged over, well, sometimes those same studies that you're retweeting. And I've gotten to the point where it's like, I want to go back to that. The reason I am on Twitter is to hear about cool studies and cool ideas. And now it's just like I mute anybody who's expressing outrage. I don't want to block them because I don't want to offend them, because sometimes, they're people I like. But you just kind of like try to cultivate your feed, and it never works. It always just goes back to getting out of hand.
The mute button is useful because people don't know if you've muted them.
Yes, you taught me that.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing, so this goes something, the way I've changed, the way I've used social media is aligned with Azim. So I'm not perfect. I've made lots of mistakes on social media, and then I reflect on them. So one of the things you can do on Twitter that turns out to be a way of kind of harassing people and causing them a lot of psychological distress is when you quote tweet and criticize them, because then everybody in your network sees it. And then if you have people who are like loyal to you or your friends or whatever, they might go and start commenting or adding other kind of nasty things in that person's thread, and they pick up their phone and they've got like 20 people insulting them or something. And I've had that happen to me, for posting, as you said, my thread's probably, my account's pretty innocuous. I'll post like some article or something, and people will do that. And then I'm about to go to bed and I check my phone. I'm one of those terrible people. I'd love to see by show of hands, by the way, how many people check their phones for their social media feed right before they go to bed? Like last thing you do before like you go to unconsciousness. I did this in a room before Azim was there, and it's like everybody puts up their hand, from senior faculty to graduate students. And so you do that, and you have all these people piling on you or mischaracterizing you, or you misstated something. And it's a really distressing and upsetting thing. And I've had it while I'm trying to give my kid a bath, and I check something and I see this, and I have to respond and recharacterize it. It's a really awful thing. So I did that to a colleague. They posted something that was kind of like snarky, and I thought it mischaracterized something, and I did that. And then they immediately claimed they were just joking, and I didn't realize that. And then I felt bad, and I'm just like, I'm never gonna do this to somebody again. Even there, I wasn't trying to be mean, but I realized that's how they perceived it. And so I think that's one thing. The other thing I've done, so I don't check my feed before I go to bed, is I did a challenge with my introduction to psychology class. So it's, again, over 300 people. I challenged them to delete all their social media apps for 24 hours, and then just like as an experiment, report back how they felt. And some of them like had FOMO, but a lot of them are like, I slept better. I actually read something. I just chatted with I called an old friend instead. And so after, I had kind of the same thing. I wasn't like obsessively doom scrolling, which is now like, especially during COVID, where you're stuck inside your home, just all of us. And there's a lot of doom to scroll through. Don't get me wrong. The outrage is almost always justified right now. So it's not that I disagree with the premise of a lot of it, but you get stuck in this for like, an hour or two where you should be like doing something else or going to sleep or engaging with your friends or family. And you feel miserable even though you're addicted. It's like driving and you see a car crash, you have to slow down and like check it out. And so we do these things even though they aren't healthy, just like we eat unhealthy food and we have bad diets, even though we know better. And so I deleted those apps and I haven't put them back on my phone. If I want to go on Twitter, I have to like log into my computer or my laptop. It's just more effortful, and it kind of has that element of overcoming what Molly said, which is I don't want to just be habitual. I don't want to be reacting to something while I'm in the elevator for 10 seconds. And it's like I'm trying to get something out without thinking through it. And so that kind of changes the dynamic for me, changes how I engage cognitively. And I try to be someone who sends out more positive, constructive, and accurate things. To go back to Regina's original point, we all have a role to play in creating an ecosystem and role modeling, especially if you're on this call and you're a faculty member. My students see it, my graduate students, my undergrads. And so I try to be more conscious of trying to be mindful about that they're looking to me about how to model it. And when I see some of my colleagues being really nasty to one another or childish, I think, well, their students are seeing that. Kind of like you don't want to be an a-hole if you're a parent and then your kids see it, same thing. So that's kind of how I think about it now.
And if I can add, Jay, I'm glad you mentioned the apps, because that's been my number one piece of practical advice about social media for several years, which is delete the apps. Ideally, don't use social media on your phone at all. But I know doesn't work for everybody. Not everybody has a computer. Some people only get on the internet via their phone. But if you're going to use your phone, make sure you have to log in through the very clunky mobile web browser to Twitter's website or Facebook's website, which is super annoying. And they deliberately designed them, I think, to not work super well because they want you on the app because they get more data that way. And yet, if you do it that way, you don't get notifications, so you don't get your phone dinging every few seconds telling you about every mean tweet somebody posted. And you have to decide, you have to make an active volitional choice. I will now log into the website. And I think that helps a lot with the way that social media has come to be this sort of default boredom stopper, where if you're sitting in the doctor's office, if you're riding a bus or whatever, it's no longer that you were carrying a newspaper with you. It's now you just take out your phone and instantly you start scrolling, and that just kills 15 or 20 minutes. And the problem, I think, there's lots of reasons why that's bad for personal health, but democratically, for good democratic societies, it's really bad because it lets us all treat these conversations we have with people on the internet as just a means of alleviating boredom. And what's great for alleviating boredom is getting into a fight. Start a fight with somebody about something on social media, say something mean that makes them upset or shows that they're wrong and makes everyone see that they're wrong. And then your bus gets to your bus stop and you put your phone away and you're done with the conversation. Meanwhile, they and the people they're interacting with have all been stirred up and you've forgotten about it until the next time you need to alleviate boredom. And that's a really bad dynamic. If our public discourse, if the way we decide on public policy and public moral norms or epistemic norms is determined by what we can do to keep ourselves occupied between bus stops, that's a real big problem. So not using your phone in this way, deleting the apps, not just relying upon it as an automatic boredom filler, making it effortful and a choice you make whenever you use social media, that can prevent a lot of those problems.
Okay, well, that gives us an interesting opportunity here, right? Because it seems like if you're during the pandemic, especially if you're an academic, you're probably at home anyways. You're probably not taking the bus very much, which means that right now we would be in the best possible position to delete the apps. And I mean, we as in the audience would be in the best possible position to delete the apps from our phones. So we've got this voting function in the participants panel on Zoom. So if you guys open up Zoom, you have a yes and you have a no button. How many of you guys are willing to delete your Twitter app from your phone right now? If you are, I'll do it. Put yes. And if you're not, Simon just did it. Good job, Simon. And if you're not, you have to vote and you have to say no. And you have to know that you're letting down democracy. So I'm going to do it right now. While we're doing that, I will ask a softball question to Jay, just because my attention is divided. And say, Jay, so given that we're talking about the context of the pandemic, how has the pandemic, oh, and Molly, I want to ask you the same question afterwards. How has the pandemic affected this sort of online social media life?
So I think it's affected a few things. So one is, and this is the worst part, is that we are now, the World Health Organization titled that we're facing an infodemic. So we now have a tsunami of misinformation about one of the most catastrophic public health crises in the last century, if not the most. And it's fed obviously by public officials, people who should be leaders. But then we have a receptive audience for it. So it's an interaction between elites and average citizens. And so now I tune in to I'm getting misinformation on Instagram by my uncle, or I tune into Facebook and my aunt is telling everybody not to take the vaccine. And these are people who have no expertise whatsoever on these topics. And it's not clear that they're actually reading accurate news about it either. They're listening to YouTubers who've been banned from Medium for posting misinformation, as I'm finding out where they're getting it. And so it's kind of normally it's one thing if you're arguing about crowd sizes and which is bigger. That's the foundational act of alternative facts being coined in the US. But that's meaningless. That's meaningless nonsense. Now we're talking about something that's, in the US alone, almost 300,000 people have died, probably more. We don't have precise estimates. And people are still spreading nonsense. We're 9 months into it. And I get this when I post about it because they fill up in my mentions about people spreading conspiracy theories and misinformation too, from random. I had one from an hour ago before I logged in, and I look and the guy has 1 follower. And I'm like, that might be a bot. Seems likely it's a bot, but you don't know if it's a real person or not. And so that's the one thing. And then the other element of the pandemic is, as you alluded to, we're all at home. I'm in my office for one of the first weeks I've been at my office in 9 months, but we're home, we're bored, we can't see our friends or family. In fact, social media is one of the best ways we can stay in touch with them. And so that's an enormous, we haven't talked about the positive aspects of technology, but I love that. I love that I can Skype my parents or text my brother from in Canada, they're far away. And so social media has given us all these really cool ways of staying in touch and reducing loneliness, sharing our work, of learning about exciting things. I follow this great, amazing list of scientists, including all of you three. And I love when I hear about your work fresh, 6 months before the journal publishes it. Or Regina publishes a really cool paper on how social media is a big god. And it's in an outlet I wouldn't have seen, but it's so interesting. And so I love that about you can curate this really interesting, brilliant list of people that you normally could never do and see their work months before anybody else does, before it comes out through traditional outlets. And so it's kind of the best part of it is being at your favorite conference in the hotel. The hotel bar where you're talking to people. It's all these cool, interesting conversations with people you find interesting and smart. And you get to kind of join any conversation you want. And so that's just so appealing that it's very addictive. But it's we're all stuck now, and it's just getting muddied by a lot of misinformation and nonsense, including by people we love. And it's it's scary. It's scary for me to see my uncle sharing that information. And then I have to call my parents and tell them, you can't believe that. And here's why. Don't go to any events with him. You might die. And so it's kind of like just ratcheted up the kind of feeling that we're in some science, it feels like Black Mirror now, the current situation. So I'll pass to Molly. That's my baton handing off right at the Black Mirror moment for Molly.
Yes, great. Yeah, so I mean, I think I have a lot of thoughts on how the pandemic has interacted with the dynamics that we already saw on social media. And Jay pointed out and has done really important research on, I think, one of the most deadly consequences, which is misinformation. Aside from that, I think the pandemic has really crystallized for me a concern that I had before, which is one of the great hopes of social media was its democratizing function of outrage, right? Like you could speak truth to power and take down the bad actors that have a lot of power, and small people can get together and coordinate their outrage and enact social change that way. And I do think that this can happen, and I do think there are good examples of this happening. But one worry is that the algorithms don't care how effective is the outrage that's being expressed. They just amplify everything. And so in the pandemic, I have seen quite a lot of outrage online, and a lot of it is rightfully directed towards the utter failure of leadership around the world to enact policies that will save lives. And a lot of it is directed towards individuals who don't wear masks in stores or who are not staying at home 100% of the time. And the fact is, because of the failure of leadership, individuals don't have good choices to make. And on top of that, there's evidence from the public health literature that shaming people for failing to follow public health guidelines can be counterproductive because it creates stigma. So for example, with the case of COVID, a lot of people, because of the stigma that COVID has now, aren't reporting that they have it, which makes it harder for public health officials to trace the spread of the disease. And so one thing that is really problematic about social media and its capacity to amplify outrage is that it's just amplifying all the outrage all the time. And it's making it a lot more difficult, I think, to coordinate and hold accountable those who actually have the power to enact policies that would get us out of this situation. So that's something that I've found really worrying in the context of the pandemic.
I want to, I think those are all really good points. The interesting thing about the pandemic for me, though, is it's actually pushed me back the other way. Like I've been very, very down on social media for a long time, and I've started to see some value from it. One is the thing Jay already mentioned about, like, under lockdown, being able to be in contact with your family and friends is incredibly important. But I've also noticed an interesting epistemic value, which you wouldn't have expected. And it came from me that I feel like I kind of knew this was coming a bit earlier than most people did, most people in North America. I actually remember a faculty meeting, beginning of March, where I said at one point, this might be the last time we're all sitting together in a room. And people laughed. And I wasn't joking. And then 2 weeks later, the university closed, and we haven't been back to campus since then. And the reason why I knew that most people in the room didn't was because about 3 months before that, I started following a bunch of epidemiologists on Twitter. Back when the earliest news from China started appearing, and I was wondering, is this thing really going to be one of the ones that takes off, the pandemic that takes off? Who knows? Well, I'll just pick a bunch of epidemiologists with good credentials and I'll just follow them on Twitter. And I was watching them argue, and then slowly over the course of January, February, coming to a consensus that this was a real threat and that it seemed like it was impossible to stop it now, that it was going to spread around the world. That's how I became convinced. And what I still don't know, almost a year later, is whether I was just, whether I deserve epistemic credit because I was so thoughtful and I figured out who the right experts were and I followed the right people and I formed the right conclusions based upon thoughtful analysis of their thoughts, or whether I was just incredibly lucky that I followed the right people. Instead, I could have picked a different group of experts who would have misled me with their expertise, and I would have believed some crazy conspiracy stories. And I don't know, a year on, was I lucky that I just happened to pick the right people who kind of saw what was coming, or was I actually doing something really good that I can reliably repeat in the future and figure out who the right experts are and follow them? So anyway, I don't know the answer to that, amazingly, still a year later. But what I do want to say is, if I was lucky or if I was successful, it is true that if you find the right people on Twitter and you follow them, you can learn about stuff, genuinely learn about actual things from real experts before most people are aware of them. And it's that, like, that attraction, it's that sense. I'm doing the research myself that is also at the foundation of people doing conspiracy theory stuff. So it's double-edged. It's like I get out ahead of everybody else, and if you're very lucky, you actually get real information. And if you don't, then it's actually worse than not paying attention at all. And that's, anyway.
Yeah.
It's double-edged.
Well, so Gina, that's really interesting, because I think most of the audience has probably seen that famous network graph of the red and blue hubs. I think, Jay, that's from your paper with Billy. Is that right?
Yeah, that's Billy's dissertation. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Billy's dissertation has this great chart where you have all the red people and the blue people, and they talk amongst each other, and there's very little talking between each other. Recently, I've seen some research by Gordon Pennycook, which shows a similar chart, but not for the Republicans and Democrats, but for people who are high on cognitive reflection and people who are low on cognitive reflection. So these people seem to cluster together as well, and they polarize in terms of basically your cognitive orientation and your willingness to be a reflective person like Gina is doing. So yes, you might have people like Gina attaching themselves in her network to the very thoughtful epidemiologists, but you're polarizing a whole other group of people who are clustering in kind of these low information bits. So what is the outcome of that sort of polarization of like epistemic style or approach or ability? Any of you?
I haven't seen that figure. That sounds cool. It makes sense. My take of it is, and again, this is kind of what social media affords. It allows people like Regina to handpick and curate this list of world-leading epidemiologists that are at other institutions around the world and be privy to all their private conversations. It can also allow you to customize a list of people that you want to follow that are conspiracy theorists or people who are like terrible at analytic thought. And so we have to understand that we're in a weird bubble. So I'll give you an example. When I talk, one of my students, Ani Sternisko, got me doing research on conspiracy theories. And I go into a room of academics and I'll ask them, how many people have heard of Me Too? And everybody in the room puts up their hand. And that's been a revolutionary social movement triggered in part by a hashtag on Twitter. And it's revolutionized a lot of institutions around, gender-based justice and harassment, discrimination against women. So people all have heard of it. It's on the front page of every newspaper for the last few years. I up until recently, I would ask them, have you heard, before the pandemics, we haven't been at many talks, have you heard about QAnon? And maybe one person out of 30 or 40 put up their hand. And then I show them the data that just as many people have been tweeting about the QAnon hashtag as Me Too on social media for the same time frame. And you start to realize, like, the epistemic community we're in is very aware of one, and has, we've had in our department, our Title IX person come in and explain the policies and change department and university-wide policies around this. Yet we haven't even heard of the other one. And so there's this whole weird, but not non-substantial. It represents something like 7% of Americans are supporters of this, including people in the White House, of QAnon, which is like these people who have a terrible epistemic model of understanding the world. It's a conspiracy theory. There's no data. It's repeatedly falsified. And it comes with an enormous amount of moral force, because if you believe it's true that people are engaging in these sex trafficking rings, of course you should be outraged. And so that's kind of the challenge of these. It's like, not only they're wrong, but they're wrong in a really extreme, provocative, binding way that if you believe it, you should do something about it. Compelling way, maybe is a better term. So I think that's like the promise and the pitfall of modern social media technology.
Okay. So there's a few remaining topics that I wanted to hit. Maybe we'll try to hit them. I don't know. We'll see how it goes. So Jay briefly mentioned a piece that Regina wrote about big gods as or the internet as a big god. Regina, can you explain what that was about?
Well, Azim, would you explain what big gods are? Because you know a lot more about that than I will, and then I'll take it off from there to how I used it in the internet context.
Sure. So I'm using this as a segue to talk about the public shaming stuff. So the idea of big gods is a theory about the development of religion and why it's been so effective. Uh, One of the cultural innovations that's been built over thousands of years is this idea of having an omniscient and omnipotent God that can see all and then punish people for transgressing in ways that you wouldn't be able to punish somebody, or you wouldn't be able to believe that you could be punished if you felt like you were in an anonymous situation before. And this wasn't how gods initially were. Gods previously, like in small scale societies, in earlier times, gods didn't have this omnipotent power. They couldn't see everywhere. And it seems like something that has been innovated because it's so effective at motivating people and motivating people to follow the rules and deterring them from breaking them.
Yeah, so I learned about this idea first from you, from Azim, and I applied it in this piece you're referring to think about social media and the internet. Because my thought was that increasingly social media has come to step into the role the big God once occupied, where it's this all-seeing thing through everybody's cell phone cameras and monitoring everybody's feeds all the time through everybody's individual eyes and ears, and that is basically allowing us to track and punish the wrongdoers. So I wrote this column back during the summer at the height of discussions about the protests against racial injustice and policing, and then more so the responses to them. So after that, there were a bunch of people saying really crude and insensitive things about these protests, and there were counter responses to that, and there was a lot of drama on the internet about this. In some cases, clearly people were doing something really objectionable, and in other cases, it was people were just they were fighting. They were looking for something to fight about. And part of my thought was that social media has stepped in to play this role of always knowing what people are doing and making sure they can't get away with it. If somebody does something that is morally wrong and that they would have 20 years ago, almost no one would have noticed. Now, through the power of social media, we can all gang up on them and we can manifest together the big God that makes sure that you can't just get away with doing bad stuff unseen by most people. And so that's really double-edged, right? Because it can have a beneficial effect in some cases of genuinely providing a disincentive for bad behavior. But in many other cases, it can just be misapplied. It can be an unfair amount of pressure or pain put on people who did relatively small things. And it can also, of course, spiral off into itself and basically become a conformity mechanism. So it's really dangerous, and I don't think we know what to do about it yet or how to handle it. And maybe and my fundamental worry, the reason why the big God image is so helpful, is I'm not sure we can control it, because it's not any one person's choice. It's not up to me what social media does. It's not up to Mark Zuckerberg what social media does. I mean, he has some control over it, but in the end, it's all of us collectively. It's millions of people making individual, uncoordinated choices that constitutes the big God of social media. And it might just be that there's no one who's in a position to tell it to stop doing what it's doing. That's the scary part.
Yeah, it's such a good metaphor, because one of the things that I find troubling about these internet mobs is the difficulty in getting that proportionality right? Matching your degree of pain that you're extracting on the transgressor for their perceived transgression. I would disagree that God got this right all the time as well, but I think believers probably wouldn't. They would say that came from a divine commandment, therefore that is the right proportion. I believe in that. If you're going to accept the God, you're probably accepting the proportional decisions he's making, but we probably don't accept that about people, and it gets out of control. So Molly, you had this, I think you want to say something else, which, why don't you just go with what you were going to say? Well, here's what I was going to say. You mentioned to me a hypothesis you had a few months ago, where you said that one of the things that's ramping up our moral outrage is the fact that a lot of things have become moralized in the pandemic, because every action we take seems to affect other people more than it otherwise would, or every action we don't take is moralized. And so that kind of makes us really sensitized to moral transgressions out there.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is a wild speculation. I have no data to back this up. So, like, take everything I say with a grain of salt. But it seems to me like we are living in a time of profound moral uncertainty, right? I mean, it didn't used to be the case that every time we left our house, we had to do a calculation of like, am I putting other people at inappropriate or unacceptable amounts of risk? And this is compounded with the fact that societal norms around justice, gender, race are changing really, really quickly. And so we are often finding ourselves these days, I think, in a state of just a lot of ambiguity and uncertainty around like, am I doing the right thing? And when you combine that with the fact that like our moral character is the first thing that other people notice about us, and it's the thing that we most care about extracting about other people, and it's the kind of information that spreads the most far and has the most consequences for our social lives, like these are really stressful times. And Jill Jordan and Dave Rand have some work showing that when you express moral outrage and when you punish moral transgressions, this sends a signal to other people that you're a good and trustworthy person. And so when you juxtapose these two observations against one another, it seems like a natural consequence of these times that we're in, that we might be more inclined to express outrage as a way to show, whether that's intentionally or just sort of instinctually, that we're on the right side of history. We're one of the good guys. You can trust us, etc. And actually, Gina, you in one of your pieces, I think you wrote about this, and there's a phrase that I really love, something about Twitter trying to make certainty at the bleeding edge of these really ambiguous issues. And I think that that's just a really important idea, and something that we should be aware of, that the times that we're in now really lend themselves to a strong motivation, whether that be an explicit motivation or one that's just sort of built into us, the way that we evolved. Like everyone, I think, is sort of on the edge of their seat these days.
All right, well, there was one other topic that I wanted to get to, which is a little further afield from all of our research. So we're all, to some degree, moral psychologists or philosophers. But one of the big concerns about social media is the effect on well-being and mental health. Jonathan Haidt, Jay's colleague at NYU, and Greg Lukianoff published this book a couple of years ago called The Coddling of the American Mind. And they had this hypothesis that the rise of social media has led to spiking rates of depression and suicide among young people. They didn't present very much evidence for that. They had some correlational evidence. Do any of you guys know the state of the evidence on that right now, or the state of the research? Okay, we'll just leave. Okay,
my understanding is it's reasonably contentious because it's correlational data. When there's experiments, E.B. Orban is somebody who does these like experiments, and she finds there's very small negative effects when you do controlled experiments on negative affect from social media use. I saw a paper on it recently, maybe it's in Current Directions in Psych Science. It's like, we're now moving forward in the research question, which is, for whom is it bad and under what circumstances? And I think a lot of our conversation's been like, you could use social media for good. Like Regina said, to follow all the epidemiologists at the beginning of a pandemic would be like the smartest possible use of social media. Or you could use it for bad. And I think what John's point is too, is that it's selectively harmful for teenage girls on things like Instagram, where there's a lot of like body shaming and stuff like that. And so I have a daughter and a son, and the thought of like letting them use Instagram to share like pictures of their bodies when they're kids is like horrifying to me. It just doesn't seem worth the risk. Whereas like, if they want to like, once they're like old enough, they want to post stuff on Facebook of like their trips and their thoughts and stuff, I feel like that's less harmful. So, or my son asked me, actually, maybe it was last night, if he can create a YouTube channel where he shares videos of him playing like video games, because that's what he watches on. And I made some rules about like no insulting everybody, no bullying, no mean jokes, and no sharing your address and stuff. And so I'm gonna let him try it. So I think like there probably are things you can do to use social media that are good or reasonable, not harmful. So I think like saying social media is bad for your mental health looks like at this point a massive overstatement, and wrong probably at the general level, but specific subgroups using specific platforms in specific ways, it seems like there's data emerging that actually might be a way to understand who it's harmful for. And I'll just say this, I have, we've been talking a lot, but a lot of our focus has been on Twitter. I go to I have a profile now on LinkedIn, and I go there and it's like, peaches and daisies all day long. Everybody's talking about how hard they're working and how they've overcome everything. And so it's kind of like the norms there, because you're linked to your employer's account, is not to do any of this insulting stuff. There's also a norm of like trying to get a better job. So you're trying to like take more credit than you deserve about how hard you worked. And so like the norms and the constraints and the design there are just like a total different universe. than Twitter. And then you can go to like Instagram, and at least the people I follow, it's just like people who produce comics for the New Yorker and like family posting vacation photos. It's just like not that interesting. So I love Twitter because it's more interesting intellectually, but the norms and the way people act are very different. So that's something also to think about, is what platform you're using and what the norms are around the people you're interacting with likely have a huge impact on your experience of it.
Yeah, and I guess it's interesting that there's enough different types of social media now that we can sort of delineate the ingredients that contribute to what outcomes. And if the observation is, well, social media can have positive effects and can have negative effects, and really what we're trying to do is domesticate this kind of wild psychological process that comes out of these social media networks and kind of push it more towards the good end than the bad end, we could kind of identify what features are having that effect and which features are having that effect, and then try to at least somehow convince the multi-billion-dollar organizations behind them to kind of push those features. And one of them that I've seen recently is, well, do you really want to share that article? You haven't read it. That's like, maybe not. Maybe that pause is all you need to get people to be a little more reflective. Okay, let's open this up to the questions from the audience who've been writing a bunch, and somehow Jay's managed to speak and answer questions in the chat. I've not even managed to read what's going on in the chat. So there was one that I saw, which I'll ask, and then I'll try to catch up on the rest, which was how are the disagreements that are happening on social media spilling over into how we treat each other off social media in person? So any of you can take that.
Can I just say one thing that I noticed that's weird is when you're on social media and it's like everybody's at each other's throat some days, as you pointed out, rightly, and it feels like very conflictual and tense, and it feels like things are gonna explode into something. And then I like walk out of my office and like down the hall or out into the street, and it just things feel so calm. And I'm like in New York on Broadway, like New York's not normal, where I live is not normally described as calm. I walk out and I'm just like, you'll have a conversation about the most mundane thing with somebody, and it just feels like the temperatures drop like 20 degrees. And so there's part of it, I think, that social media carries over into our life. But there's also, I'm noticing more and more, a discordance between real life and online. And it feels really, some days, very jarring to walk out of social media, kind of read the room, and then walk down the street and read the room. And so that's also something, again, like maybe a misperception about what the norms are of your fellow citizens or something like that.
Yeah, so two points on spillovers from online to offline, and I'll first say that there's not a ton of good data on this. This is a really, really hard question to study, and Billy Brady and I are actually exploring some ideas around this, sort of combining methods for directly messaging people on Twitter as they're using it, and then contacting them later and asking them about their experiences in real life. But we've seen multiple examples now of real world violence in the streets perpetrated by individuals who were radicalized online. And, that's all I need to say. This is a huge problem and something that we should all be concerned about. A more mundane, but perhaps more widespread and maybe ultimately more pernicious spillover is again arising from these misperceptions and false consensus, right? If we are being fed information that is really unrepresentative of how both our side and the other side sees the world and what their attitudes are about political issues, this could make people less willing to engage with family members and friends who they suspect might be of a different mindset than them, politically speaking. And there's a lot of data showing that people are just really unwilling and reluctant to talk to family members about politics now, perhaps because they're worried that these offline conversations with family might resemble what they're seeing online. And so, again, the sort of the norms of discourse are really different, but maybe people don't believe that they are. There's a blurring in our heads of what we think political discussions are going to be like in real life and how we see them unfolding online. And so, yeah, I think it would be worth exploring sort of people's beliefs about that.
Yeah, I think that's really right. I want to build on points that both Jay and Molly made, and just draw a distinction between two different ways we can see this kind of spillover happening. One is direct behavioral effects of disinformation or misinformation, where you're being tricked into conspiracy theories, so you go off and do something radical, dangerous, violent, ill-advised because you have false beliefs. And that's almost the easy case. I mean, it's not good, but it's easy case to see it happening and to measure it. The harder stuff to measure that I think we're only starting to figure out how to, and I have a lot of empathy for social scientist colleagues who are much more bound by data than I am as a philosopher, but I think we're starting to see it happening, is the way in which the forms of discourse, by which I mean like how we argue, how we talk to each other, what kind of expectations we have, that those can be slowly changed. And the problem is that we're not going to see that right away. Kind of the way we've been talking about it, as you might like the way you framed at the beginning, we on this panel are all about the same age. We've had about 20 years to watch the slow changes. And the things that are happening right now on social media that have only happened in the last 5 or 6 years, we're probably not going to be able to notice the effects of those things for another 10 or 15 years. And by then, they'll be pervasive in a way that it'll be really hard to undo them. That's one of the scary parts of a phenomenon that goes all through our lives, is that it's so slow and gradual and step by step by step that you can't see it in the moment. And then by the time you can see it, it's just there. And people who've come up and been raised in that system, and educated in that system, won't see anything but it. And so this is where I think it's really interesting to look back. I've been reading right now recently people like Marshall McLuhan or Neil Postman. These are critics of television and cable news, writing 30 to 50 years ago about how television was going to ruin people's capacity. And it looks funny to me because television was already there when I was born, and I had no conception of what the world was like before television. And then some of their predictions are silly. Like some of them just look funny now. They look like they look naive and misunderstood how TV worked. But the basic structure helps you see how there were these presumptions about how people interacted before we had TV that are just totally invisible to those of us who were born in the last 50 years. And I think what we're getting to now is this inflection point where the internet is coming over that same hump, where there's people now who are voting adults, responsible adults who don't have any memory of the pre-internet world. And so the really interesting question now is, can we from that vantage point start seeing those long-term effects? I don't know yet, but it's really hard.
Can I add one thing that Regina's alluding to? I think that I always worry about in myself. I worry that we're going to be like, all the stuff we're talking about, someone in 20 years is going to look back and it's going to be like used in a lecture to show like, it's just part of the history of people like freaking out over technology. Like I had a colleague in classics who was talking about like showed evidence of like people freaking out about the written word because like storytelling is really how you have to do it. And the moment we write it down, it's going to erode it. So its meaning gets transmitted to somebody away from its original purpose and context and storyteller. And it's like, it's absurd. And I do worry that there's a risk of us like hyperventilating and just being part of a history of people like overreacting to like bicycles and TV and all these things. On the other hand, I do feel like we have we're getting enough data at least to know that the misinformation and things like that have gotten so bad. And at least the social conflict of like polarization, things like that have gotten bad, and the threat to democracy, as Regina pointed out, have gotten bad. And there's also, they say this, like, if it turns out not to be terrible, part of it might be because we put enough pressure on government or corporations to like update their algorithms in ways that are better. So like this is something that happened in the last US election. All the social media companies are ready to start immediately labeling misinformation about the election. And so who knows if that helped at all, but the awareness and pressure to do that might have mattered. And this is happening actually in a lot of these tech giants right now, is Facebook employees and stuff like that are like revolting against these power structures because they see what it's doing and they don't want to be part of it. And there was a really good, some investigative journalism recently about how in Facebook, they like tried out an alternative algorithm, which actually promoted higher quality, more accurate content in your feed. But then they found it like incrementally decreased engagement and people were online a little less. And so like it got nixed by the higher ups at Facebook. And so like people are getting really disgruntled. The satisfaction in these organizations is dropping. And then I thought in a great stroke of irony, Facebook has their own internal social media platform for companies to talk and express concerns or share ideas. And apparently it's amplifying the most extreme concerns of employees in the company because it's built on the same algorithm that your Facebook's built on. And so like people like Zuckerberg are under enormous fire internally. Part of it's because they have an algorithm that amplifies and makes people motivated to say a more extreme thing than they really believe in, because that's what gets upfed so that other employees at Facebook see it. And so there is this, I don't know if that is might be the greatest stroke of irony. So I don't know how many of these leaders will survive, another 4 years. There's also suggestions that there's pressure along the line of the Senate to regulate it. Companies in places like, I think Germany has rules now about sharing misinformation, and companies can be held liable. And so there is a possibility for we as citizens or as employees of these organizations can exert enough pressure, change laws and guidelines to make it better. Kind of like TV has guidelines about advertising and accuracy and things like that. So there's no reason that we shouldn't have these for social media. In fact, it's quite surprising historically that we haven't done that.
So it's probably a good time to move to this like potential solutions part of the discussion, because that's something that's coming up in the chat quite a bit as well. And Regina, I know you've talked about this in some of your talks that I watched on YouTube. It seems like there's these three stakeholders here, right? And there's these three people that you could expect to change. One is the companies who face this profit motive. And if they have a profit motive to be the misinformation social network and they have enough people to sustain that, then will that be a profitable thing to do, as has happened in the news sphere. You could also expect the people to change, us. We've been talking about trying to model appropriate social media behavior. And then you can have the government come in and make regulations. And obviously there's interactions and intersections between all these groups. Jay, you seem to be implying that you think the best bet is like social norm pressure from the people onto the government, so the government can put some regulations onto the companies. Gina and Molly, what do you guys think?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think it might be easier in some countries than others, because unfortunately in the US, the corporations have enormous power politically, and so because of how much money is in politics in the US, it's going to be really tricky, I think, to mount a political response. And the companies, big tech companies are spending tremendous amounts of money lobbying to keep the regulations in their favor. And I mean, we could have a whole other discussion about the ethical implications of the fact that Mark Zuckerberg, who controlled a lot of information around the election, has a vested interest in one set of politicians gaining power because they have expressed different preferences with respect to regulating Facebook. But yeah, I think that, as with many, large problems in society, structural policy-based solutions are going to be more effective than trying to make change at the level of individuals.
Oh, so this is one place where I think I'm going to disagree with the other panelists, because I actually think that state or government solutions are likely to be a bad idea for the most part, with the exception that I think these companies need to be more transparent what they're doing. So state pressure, government pressure to make them more transparent is good. But other than that, I'm incredibly wary of any attempt to use regulation to make them behave better, because once you set up a mechanism for that, then it will attract people with the worst possible instincts in government. Like the politicians and the regulators who want to control the flow of information, those are the ones who I think it's just going to draw them to that. And a really good example of that right now is the debate in the US over Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which I won't go into the whole story, but basically it gives these platforms a freedom from legal liability for the things people post on them. And there's lots of arguments we could have about whether that's good. And in fact, that does need to be reformed if there's going to be any effective regulation. However, where the pressure is coming from right now to regulate that is from Donald Trump and his cronies in Congress, who want that overturned so that the federal government can punish Facebook for not sharing the news Donald Trump wants it to share. And so I think that's just like a crystallized example where if you start poking at this from the state direction, it instantly attracts people like Donald Trump or more clever people who want to try to manipulate the system to try to hinder their political opponents. So this is why I would be very wary of any state-based approach. And that does mean we have a huge problem with figuring out other solutions, which I think have to, unfortunately, do kind of have to come from a combination of users and the platforms themselves. It's just very hard to do. But anyway, that's maybe an inflammatory enough comment, so I'll leave that one out there for right now. I worry about any state solution just because in the future it will attract bad people.
And I'll concede a little bit to Regina here, which is there are states, countries that completely control social media, and these tend to be authoritarian states, and it's not a good thing. So, and then I'll just layer on, that's like the sinister, malevolent version of state regulation. In my view, the more likely one is, I don't know if anybody saw like the senatorial congressional hearings where they were like grilling the like Zuckerberg and CEOs from tech companies, and the people in charge of creating the regulations sounded like complete fools. They just sound like they don't understand how any of this even works. And so like, I'm just imagining what solutions, it's like, these are people who don't even really know, don't actively use any of their social media accounts. Probably they haven't like printed anything for themselves in 5 years or sent their own emails. So there definitely is a concern that who's gonna write these? Does it then become like lobbyists, which is how it works for a lot of these regulations in the US, and then who are the lobbyists writing these laws? So there is a lot of different ways this could go horrifyingly wrong.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think the main sort of solution at the level of the companies that's going to be really hard without some sort of incentive is the business model. The attention equals money business model is, I think, the upstream source of a lot of the problems that we've talked about today. And so how do you get them to change that model?
Yeah, so then that seems a bit concerning for the future then. Yeah, I remember talking to somebody, I think it might have been John Haidt, like 4 years ago, about saying like, where does this go? Can this keep getting worse? And he's like, I don't know, we'll see. Now it's 4 years later, and it seems like all of it has gotten worse, except for his book, which sold well. So he and Jay, you guys are profiting off this whole problem. All right, there was one, so Amori, going back to our conversation about mental health, Amori or Audrey or Carly, who've done research on some of the connections between social media and well-being and mental health stuff. Do any of you want to chime in here? I can unmute you and just briefly summarize what you guys are talking about there, because I think it'd be helpful for the group. Any of you? Oh, how are you going to let me know? Oh, Amori will. Okay, there we go. Let's see.
You'd be able to unmute yourself.
There you go.
Hi, everybody. Nice to see you guys, and thanks for hosting this great discussion, Azim. Yeah, you know, we're clinical psychologists along with Audrey and Carly, and so basically for Audrey's comprehensive exam paper, something which we recently put under review, we just got really interested in the idea about bidirectional associations between psychopathology and social media use, you know, because there's, like, as we've been talking about, there's obviously a lot of concerns that social media use might be harmful to well-being or increasing psychopathology. But, you know, we just wanted to like see what the research was on that, and then also try to disentangle that from the idea that probably people with psychopathology might tend to use social media in certain ways, like to begin with. So, you know, like what's the chicken and the egg, right? Turns out it's very hard to disentangle this because like almost all the research is cross-sectional, correlational, and using self-report data too, like of all constructs. And sometimes like the measurements, especially like of social media constructs, it's like one item or completely unvalidated, or, you know, you're a little bit like, where did you come up with this? But I do agree with Carly's general consensus. Like, for when you're trying to like, even when you're trying to like sort through things in the better quality studies from like the poorer quality studies, there might be something to the idea that using social media more frequently could, at least some people, increase in internalizing symptoms. That's like depression, anxiety stuff. But I think that if that's happening, it likely is through the process of social comparison, which is often exemplified by like passive browsing, as opposed to like actively engaging with people that you care about. But on the other hand, like people with psychopathology people with depression and anxiety tend to be using social media in like less healthy ways sometimes too. So it's like, it could just be like a vicious cycle. There's also a lot of limitations in the literature. Like, the most research has been done about depression and anxiety, but we started to look at like, what about like other types of psychopathology, like, ADHD symptoms, something our lab studies, or, delinquency, conduct problems, anger, aggression. There's really almost nothing. And the research gets like really poor quality really quickly. So we definitely see that as like a hole for future research. But in terms of like directions and like what our lab is working on, we don't know yet if this is going to work. So yeah, but we have a study going on right now. It is pre-registered on Open Science Framework, so you could also check it out, where we are actually taking users who are selected for being elevated in psychopathology in some way or another. And we're randomly assigning them to various conditions over 6 weeks, right? And one is where one is a control condition where we ask them to not do anything different than they usually do on social media. Another is an abstinence condition, which we basically like tell them to fast and like, delete their social media, like not check as much as possible. And we try to give them tips for how to do this. Turns out they're failing to do this. It's not like the adherence rate is like not great. We actually tried our best to be motivational and inspirational about that. It could be a failure on our part too. But then the third condition is something we developed where we're actually trying to encourage people to see if like, how can we get them to hopefully use social media in a way that we think is like smarter. And really it's based on like whatever research we have, which is not that much, about like what are the characteristics that might foster positive mood and well-being from using social media versus like avoiding the sorts of characteristics or behaviors or types of use that lead to the negative stuff. So, for us, a lot of it is about being like really thoughtful and mindful about it. Like, why are you using it? Like, what is the purpose? Are you getting the goals that you hope for, from using social media at this time? Most people actually do say that the best thing about social media is the social connection and their ability to feel like connected with or keep up with people who like might be hard to otherwise. So we really talk about like behaviors on social media that actually help to foster those connections and therefore those good feelings, like if that's your goal. And so can you be like mindful and choose those sorts of behaviors, which is probably more active use than passive browsing. It's probably more supportive comments. It might be like more sharing about the Subway sandwich you ate, Azim, as opposed to like ranting about Donald Trump. Honestly, if like what you're trying to do is like socially connect with people that you care about and you think care about you, that actually might be a better way. But it's going to be different for different people. Like mostly we're trying to guide people to make conscious choices about that and then to try to implement that in their life. So yeah, we're midway through this trial. Still lots of questions about how this will work, how adherent they'll be. Whether this is something that will replicate, if it apply, also if it's like equally, if like it applies equally to all groups, like all demographics or all like, types of psychopathology or types of users. But I've really appreciated this discussion. It's helped, Audrey and I have been messaging about this back and forth, and it's given me a lot of food for thought. Those are some of the things that we're doing right now. So thanks for this opportunity.
Yeah, thanks, Amori. That's great. It's really great to know that research is being done. I'm sure it's being done by similar things are being done by other labs as well. So maybe it won't take us 10 or 15 years to know the impact of this, and we'll have at least some info about how we can cultivate these things a little better. I think we'll probably shut it off here, but I want to thank you, Omori, for that. And thank you, Molly and Gina and Jay, for talking. I think we should also thank Billy Brady for being the brain behind all the research that Molly and Jay have been talking about. So thanks, Billy. And thank you guys all for joining us today. Have a good day.